Alright guys, Murph's here, and today I want to discuss a particular legend or myth that is frequently encountered in the firearms community, and that is loading basically spare change into a shotgun shell. Now, where does this kind of originate from? In general, shotguns are renowned for their ability to be able to handle a wide variety of load types, not even just like grainages and things along those lines, but you can run birdshot if you're going after some sort of upland game. You can run buckshot for defensive type purposes. You can run slugs in order to be able to take large game. At short distances, but big game nonetheless. As well as less than lethal rounds if you're in some sort of law enforcement type capacity, and a number of other specialty rounds have been developed for the 12 gauge, some of questionable viability. Something that's been previously discussed on this channel would include things like the Bolo round or Dragon's Breath, there we go, which like the movie John Wick made that stuff seem like super cool, but in all actuality it's not as the movie makes it out to be. And also video games like Call of Duty. With that, people have also developed a ton of add-on type rounds. There are entire YouTube channels made up of guys loading batteries and all kinds of other payloads into shotgun shells and then testing out their efficacy on the range and having a wide variety of results. Change is kind of the origin of this, though. If you went just a little further back, you would also run into blunderbusses where you would literally just load whatever it is that you had on hand into a blunderbuss and use that to ward off pirates, or if you're a pirate, to ward off attacking Marines or something along those lines. The end state here is that the idea of stuffing random stuff into a shotgun shell is not necessarily a new concept. However, the question is still viability. Now, the earliest example I can think of for loading change into a shotgun shell is actually part of the Billy the Kid legend, which involves a time in which Billy the Kid was captured and was placed into a local jail awaiting transport to trial, all that kind of stuff. And there were two sheriff's deputies who were keeping an eye on him. Now, one guy went across the street to a cafe to get a bite to eat, while the other guy stayed with Billy the Kid. Now, one way or another, Billy the Kid managed to get a hold of a revolver, and he killed the deputy who remained behind. At that point, the other deputy, having heard the shot, ran out into the street towards the jail and was shot down with his own shotgun that was supposedly loaded with dimes. Now, supposedly this guy kept his shotgun loaded with dimes so that anyone he shot with it would be able to pay the boatman when they went to the afterlife, which I don't know if boatman's probably the correct term in this case. Lots of different cultures have this idea that you have to buy your way into the afterlife, be it with coins left on the eyes of the dead or your entire or a significant portion of your hoard that you took from monasteries or something along those lines. There's quite a few different cultures that have the same overall idea. I also find it kind of interesting because, like, we're talking the 1800s. Dimes actually get you a fair amount of stuff, so he would have had a pretty expensive payload in the barrels of his double-barrel shotgun. It would seem to be a lot more cost-effective to shoot somebody and then like flip a coin onto their corpse so that they could pay the boatman. Like, I don't understand where blowing half a paycheck into somebody's body is like this really cool gotcha type situation. But to each their own, I guess. Now, there also happens to be a pop culture reference actually in the Resident Evil series. I can't remember which movie it was. I think it was the first one that they did in the three-dimensional type method, where Mia Jovovich, her character Alice, has like, I think it was actually two sawed-off shotguns loaded up with like gold coins. And she uses it to help like take out a whole bunch of monsters and all that kind of stuff. And while very interesting, and actually gold would be an interesting use if you were to try to do this type of thing, and we'll get into that more here in a little bit. Regardless, let's go ahead and talk about the efficacy. There's a certain issue when it comes to trying to load change into a shotgun shell. Now, specifically, that change is not terribly aerodynamic. Obviously, shooting it flat like a disc, and kind of the same concept you would throw a frisbee, would be the better way to load up change into any type of firearm. Think of the disc shooters from when you were a kid. However, that's not going to load into the shotgun or the shotgun shell very well, and it's going to allow a lot of gas blow by and all that kind of stuff, which is just going to lose all the velocity and possibly deposit a whole bunch of change in your barrel. It's not going to be terribly helpful to anybody. At that point, it's a really silly blank. So you need the right size change in order to be able to fill the barrel, and for the most part, that winds up being 10 gauges in the form of dimes, which we can actually see here. I have a dime and I have a 10 gauge shell. As we can see right there, it fits almost perfectly. And I'll roll in a close-up photo as well. Now, the problem with coins, especially anything that you try to throw with its flat face forward, is they're not terribly aerodynamic. So you have a massive amount of wind resistance as soon as this thing exits the bore. In addition to that, change doesn't weigh a lot. So already you're kind of losing the velocity type aspect because you have this flat surface that you're trying to propel through the air, and then you don't necessarily have a lot of mass in order to be able to retain energy as it enters target media. So that's a big issue whenever you're talking about terminal effect within the human body. In addition to that, with that flat face moving forward and not a lot of stability being imparted by the shotgun barrel post exiting, there's a pretty good possibility, in fact it's pretty much guaranteed, that coin is going to start flipping end over end, which is going to further shed velocity, which is going to have a negative impact on energy, because velocity and mass are the things that equate to energy. To say nothing of what it'll do to the pattern as change starts flipping end over end and going all kinds of crazy places. If you think back again to those disc shooters when we were kids, they could have somewhat of an erratic flight path when they were being thrown more or less like frisbees. Now change that dynamic to something tumbling end over end. You can see where this is not going to be terribly effective outside of very short ranges. Now, I say that it's Mia Jovovich's approach, or Alice's approach in this case, of using gold coins is very interesting because at least those would have potentially a little bit more mass. However, if a bunch of dimes is kind of an expensive load, gold coins most definitely are. What are you getting for your effort? Not all that much, to be completely honest. Now, there was another experiment done with pennies. No. There was another experiment done with pennies and 12-gauge shotgun shells. However, if we look here, we will note that the penny is almost exactly the same size as a 12-gauge shotgun shell, which means that there's not really a whole lot of space in order to be able to load these up in there. I did find an example that kind of spurred this whole conversation here. I found an example of somebody who took pennies and kind of domed them out a little bit in order to be able to better fit into a shotgun shell, which also gave them more of a ballistic shape, which made them more aerodynamic and therefore a little bit more ballistically feasible. However, that's a lot of effort for still not that much mass, which is going to ultimately lead to not that much retained energy, not a lot of penetration, all those different aspects that are supposed to make for successful fighting engagements. At that point, you're just better off with buckshot or slug. Either of those have more mass, more energy, more predictable shot patterns, and are actually effective fight stoppers. Now, are there any examples of this ammunition in a manufactured sense provided by any ammunition manufacturer? And actually there are. If you look at the Hornady Critical Defense line, they have a load that was specifically developed for the Judge and that whole family of 410 revolvers that also includes the Smith & Wesson Governor, in which it was a whole bunch of stacked flat discs. Now, this is kind of interesting because that line of revolvers does have a rifled bore, and at least would impart some spin to that payload, perhaps allowing it to better orient itself through air. I have experimented with that load before through a 410 shotgun, and I have to say that the pattern that I got out of it was highly unimpressive at pretty short distances. If I get the opportunity, maybe I've got some footage lying around from there, but I think that it well predates the channel. I think it well predates my taking of footage and pictures and stuff like that for these types of purposes. Regardless, I would not consider that ammunition to be a proper, viable defensive load, no differently than I don't consider the entire concept of 410 revolvers to be effective options. It always struck me as far too gimmicky and not something that was actually effective, which really is kind of the basis of this entire discussion. Gimmicky ammunition is just that. It's gimmicky. It's not that helpful, and there's actually potentially a lot of risk associated with it. So I have no shooting portion for this outside of perhaps taking the time to spend some of my hard-earned money on some of that Hornady critical defense ammunition, which is not of overall options that I have going on right now for where my funds could go. That's not standing out as a very prime option. Guys, I don't get paid for the content that I put on YouTube, so the money that I spend on this channel has to be helpful to me in some way in order to spur my continued expertise or skill development in the firearms field. So with that kind of gets to the point here. Not only do I not consider this to be a viable method and even worthy of really a lot of my time, effort, or money in order to corroborate that fact, but you run into a lot of potential concerns whenever it comes to trying to run this ammunition through a standard shotgun, because some of the things you have to take into account is what type of choke you have and is it capable of being able to handle that type of load moving through the choke. So in the case of 10 gauge dimes, I own a 10 gauge. Ostensibly, I could go through the process of loading up a 10 gauge shotgun shell to run through my single shot Harrington and Richardson 10 gauge SB2, which if you're interested in that, I'll post a link to that shotgun's review in the description. However, I don't have a lot of interest in doing that because that shotgun has an extra full turkey choke on it, and that's definitely not going to handle a bunch of dimes being forced through it, through that much constriction. That's a highly constricted choke. There's a very good possibility that I'm going to wind up with a high pressure event in the barrel. Zero interest at that point. I would recommend against doing this type of thing. If you have a cylinder or improved cylinder bore, sure, I guess that could work out. But what is the actual payoff that you're getting here? That money would be better spent going into your piggy bank so that you could, afford more ammunition, a new shotgun, better equipment, whatever it is that it may be, as opposed to loading it up into a shotgun barrel to fire at somebody. It's not really worth the effort. The juice isn't worth the squeeze in this case. All right, guys, nice short video this week. I hope you guys found this interesting, and that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.